What if I told you that in a forest where water pours down from the sky and the ground has turned into a cold swamp, you can get fire in a matter of minutes? Imagine a situation where it has been raining ice for several days, soaking every inch of your clothes and equipment. In such conditions, modern people with lighters and lighter fluid often find themselves powerless against the elements, panicking from the onset of hypothermia. For the indigenous peoples of North America, such weather was not a disaster, but just another challenge requiring calmness and a deep knowledge of the laws of nature. Without this skill, entire tribes would have disappeared in the first harsh autumn, but they survived where we would have perished. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how Native Americans found dry gunpowder in a thoroughly wet forest and made the flames dance in the pouring rain. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of survival? The most important tool for starting a fire in a critical situation was not hands or wooden sticks, but the human mind. When cold water penetrates clothing and the body begins to shiver, the modern human brain instantly switches to panic mode and chaotic actions. The Indians, however, perceived fire not as a chemical reaction, but as a living being that needed to be invited, not forced to appear by force. Panic led to fuss, fuss led to mistakes, and mistakes in the freezing rain cost the entire hunting party their lives. The warriors of the Great Plains in the forests of the East learned from childhood to enter a special state of concentration before working with tinder. They understood that trembling hands could not perform the precise movements necessary to strike a spark or rotate a spindle. It was like meditation, where every action was measured to the millimeter and breathing remained steady even in strong winds. Fire was considered a sacred gift that slept inside trees and stones and had to be awakened with respect and patience. Treating the flame as a relative changed the approach itself. You don't fight nature, you ask it for help. Instead of frantically breaking the first wet branches he came across, an experienced tracker would pause and carefully examine the area around him. He was looking not just for firewood, but for specific signs that indicated dry shelters hidden from the rain. This required tremendous restraint, as the instinct for self-preservation screamed for the need to move and warm up. But it was precisely this pause to assess the situation that often became the deciding factor between life and death. The ability to suppress the animal fear of cold was the first test for any young warrior. The philosophy of working with fire ruled out haste, as damp air and wet materials did not forgive carelessness in preparation. If you tried to light a fire too quickly without preparing the perfect base, you would only ruin precious dry tinder. The Indians knew that they often had only one attempt before their hands became completely numb. Therefore, 90% of the time was spent on preparation and only 10% on actually getting the spark. This is radically different from our modern desire to get instant results at the push of a button. Fire was the center of the universe for a nomadic camp, a symbol of safety and the continuation of the tribe's life. Losing it on the road was seen as a bad omen and a tough test of spirit. The keepers of the fire had a special status and knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation. They knew how to read wood and how to talk to the wind so that it would fan the coals rather than extinguish them. This spiritual connection with the element of fire made their actions confident and precise. Interestingly, this psychological aspect is often ignored in modern survival guides, which focus on technique. However, historical chronicles confirm that Europeans often perished in places where the locals felt comfortable. The difference was not in the tools, but in the mental attitude and understanding of their place in nature. Native Americans did not feel like strangers in the forest, even when that forest tried to freeze them. For them, rain was as much a part of life as the sun, and they knew how to coexist with it. The ability to remain calm allowed them to notice the smallest details that were invisible to a panicked eye. They saw dry shavings under the peeling bark of an old birch tree or dry moss under an overhanging rock. It was this tunnel vision of the survival master that allowed them to find resources in seemingly empty places. Calmness gave them access to the deep memory and experience of their ancestors, accumulated over centuries of living in the wild. It was the highest form of adaptation to the environment. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about the role of psychology in extreme situations? Is it more important than technical skills? Write about it in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episodes about ancient survival secrets. Are you ready to learn the truth about where fire hides during a flood? To the average person, a forest during a rainstorm looks equally wet and unsuitable for a campfire. However, for Native Americans, the forest was a complex system of shelters where dryness could always be found if you knew where to look. The main rule was not to look on the ground, where moisture soaks everything instantly, but in the air. Dead trees that had not yet fallen and stood upright were the main treasure troves of dry fuel. A dead tree standing upright, stripped of its bark, dries out in the wind and remains dry inside even in heavy rain. Water runs down its outer surface, hardly absorbing into the hard, weathered wood. The Indians knew that all they had to do was remove the top layer of moisture or split such a trunk to find a perfectly dry core inside. This fuel burned hot and clean, providing the energy needed to start a fire. Searching for such standing trees was the first thing the group did when they stopped at a campsite. Particular attention was paid to coniferous species, which are generously saturated with natural resins. Resin not only burns brilliantly, but also has water-repellent properties, protecting the inner fibers of the wood. Even if the outside of a pine branch appeared to be completely wet, the inside often remained dry and resinous. Hunters were able to identify such trees by the smell and color of the wood, even in twilight. This knowledge allowed them to obtain fire where deciduous trees would be useless. Another secret storehouse of dry fuel was the lower branches of dense spruce trees in the subarctic forests and mountainous regions. The tree crown acts as a giant umbrella, and dry, thin twigs always remain under the densest branches, closest to the trunk. They are called spider webs because of their thinness and ability to ignite from the slightest spark. Collecting this material required care so as not to shake water from the upper branches onto the precious tinder. These twigs were the perfect kindling, always at hand. The Indians also skillfully used natural shelters and cover provided by the terrain. Under large sloping trunks of fallen trees, the ground and forest litter often remained dry even after a day of rain. In rocky areas, they checked niches and small caves where the wind had blown dry leaves and grass. Animals also sought out such places, so knowledge of animal habits helped people find dry materials. Nature itself suggested where to look for protection from water. Don't forget about the inner bark of some tree species, such as juniper or cedar. If you carefully remove the outer wet layer and knead the fibrous inner part, you get a great nest for catching sparks. These fibers were as thin as hair and ignited instantly when properly prepared. Indians wore pouches with this pre-prepared material around their necks, under their clothes. But the ability to find it right in the forest was valued above all else. Sometimes it was necessary to resort to more complex methods, splitting thick logs to get to the core. For this, they used wedges made of hardwood or stone and heavy mallets. It was hard physical work, but it guaranteed a large amount of dry fuel. Wood chips from the center of a log were the gold standard for starting a fire in a storm. The heavier the rain, the deeper they had to penetrate the wood. In the plains where there were few trees, the tribes used dried bison dung, which they collected in advance. However, it was difficult to find dry dung in the rain, and then they had to seek shelter in ravines or under bushes. The ability to read the landscape and understand the movement of water across the terrain was critically important. They knew where water accumulated and which areas remained relatively dry. Rotten wood, which usually absorbs water like a sponge, could also sometimes be useful if found inside a hollow tree. Dry tinder, protected by the trunk of a living tree, turned into excellent kindling that could smolder for hours. Hunters checked old trees for such natural containers. This required observation and knowledge of forest biology. Each tree was considered a potential source of life. Survival in a wet world depended on the ability to see the invisible and know the structure of the forest from the inside. The Indians did not rely on luck. They used a systematic approach to finding resources. Their eyes were trained to notice the slightest deviations in color and texture that indicated dryness. But did you know that they had a way of not having to start a fire from scratch every time? Watch the video to the end, And in the next chapter, you will learn the secret of the fiery heart. Guess how long it took to create this unique invention? In fact, this technology has been refined over thousands of years, allowing people to carry fire over vast distances instead of painstakingly making it each time. The most reliable way to light a fire in the rain is to bring fire with you, hidden and protected from the elements. Native Americans used special containers, often made from bison horns or thick clay, to carry smoldering coals. The inside of such a fire horn was tightly packed with rotten wood or certain types of tinder fungi. The coals were placed in the center of this packing, where they could smolder slowly, consuming almost no oxygen and producing no open flame. In this state, the heart of fire could last for days, warming the traveler and guaranteeing a quick fire. This required masterful control of air access. Too much and the coal would burn out. Too little and it would go out. Thick bundles made of bark and moss, which worked like a thermos, were also used for carrying. Such a bundle could be carried under a cloak or in a special pouch on the belt, protecting it from rain and wind with one's body. The smoldering coal was literally pressed against the person's body, and the warrior felt its warmth, constantly monitoring the condition of his companion. Losing this coal was considered a disgrace and a sign of blatant carelessness. This technology allowed a fire to be lit in literally seconds. All you had to do was take out the smoldering coal, place it in a prepared nest of kindling, and blow on it. In heavy rain, when friction would have wasted precious energy and time, this method was a lifesaver. It was a kind of ancient lighter that was always ready for use. This was especially important for military units that needed to move quickly and stealthily. In addition to its practical use, carrying fire had a deep symbolic meaning, connecting the new camp with the old one. The fire was not created anew. It was a continuation of the same flame that burned in the native teepee or longhouse. This gave a sense of continuity of life and connection with ancestors, even in the most hostile conditions. Psychologically, this supported people by reminding them that home was where their fire burned. There were special mushrooms that grew on birch trees, which were used specifically for transporting fire due to their dense structure. They could smolder very slowly and evenly, without turning to ash prematurely. Knowledge of the properties of different types of polypores was a separate science that was learned from childhood. Not every mushroom was suitable for this purpose, and a mistaken selection could be costly. During long journeys, the responsibility for preserving the coals often fell to the most experienced women or elders. They knew how to feed the coals along the way, adding tiny pieces of fuel without stopping. It was an art of micromanaging fire, invisible to the untrained eye. The ability to keep the spark of life alive in a storm was valued no less than the ability to hunt bison. If there were no coals to take with them, they used a technique to preserve the fire at the campsite. When they left in the morning, they covered the fire with a thick layer of ash and earth, creating an airtight dome. When they returned in the evening, even in the rain, they could dig up the pile and find live red coals inside. This saved energy and time after a hard day of hunting. The fire heart is an example of the ingenious foresight and planning characteristic of indigenous cultures. They understood that resources must be conserved and prepared in advance, rather than relying on chance. Those who thought 2 steps ahead, anticipating rain even when the sky was clear, survived. Don't forget to like this if you are impressed by this ancient energy-saving technology. What if I showed you a time machine that would take us back to the moment when the first architectural masterpiece was created? When the rain is pouring down and everything around you is turning into liquid mud, it is impossible to simply stack wood and light it. The water eats away at any attempt at a spark. On days like these, a regular open fire was not only ineffective, it was a dangerous waste of energy and time. The Indians quickly realized that what they needed first was not fire, but a home for fire. Thus was born the principle of a tiny dry chamber in which a flame could be born and grow strong. When they started building a fire in the rain, the first thing they did was not look for matches, but for materials for a roof. They made a low shelter over the future hearth from pieces of bark, broad leaves, grass sods, and flat stones. They placed it so that it could withstand the wind and not collapse at the first gust. Sometimes stones were placed under the supports to prevent them from sinking into the soggy ground. This was essentially the first building in the camp. Although it was smaller than a child's head, this canopy created a safe zone, protected from direct streams of water and mud splashes. There was only enough room for a hand, a bundle of tinder, and a few thin sticks. Therefore, the shelter resembled a small roof for an invisible inhabitant. The smaller the volume, the faster it warmed up from the first weak sparks. A small space is easier to protect from the wind and heavy rain. That is why they deliberately made the home for the fire cramped. This approach was a logical continuation of their understanding of the climate. To warm the camp, you first need to warm the source of heat. Sometimes not only bark and stones were used as primary shelter, but also their own bodies. A hunter or warrior would kneel, bend his back, and form a living dome over the site of the future fire. At that moment, the person became part of the structure, not just an observer. Clothing treated with fat and smoke kept water out better than any fabric. A cloak made of bison or deer skin turned into a real roof, from which water flowed down without getting inside. Underneath it, there was a small dry space where hands with tinder and kindling could squeeze in. The person hardly moved so as not to destroy the fragile structure and let in cold air. Icy rain beat down on their shoulders and neck, tightening their muscles and taking away their warmth. But inside the small chamber, life was just beginning. Not everyone could perform such duty in the elements, so they were taught this skill from a young age. Inside the protected space, the air gradually warmed up from his breath and the heat of his hands. The tinder and small kindling began to dry out, even though a minute ago they had been cold and damp. Every movement here was important. An extra wave of the hand could knock down the coal. Too sharp a breath could blow out the nascent flame. It was an intimate dialogue between man and fire, where there was no room for fuss. While the elements raged outside, inside this tiny cavity, a future fire was being built that would warm the entire camp. When the first stable spark appeared, it was turned into a small flame without removing the protection. At first, only the thinnest, carefully selected chips were brought in, allowing the fire to grow stronger. Only when the fire held its shape confidently and did not go out with a slight breath was the shelter opened. This was done slowly, centimeter by centimeter, so as not to let water in. There was no room for haste. One unfortunate drop could bring everything back to square one. This was the art of patience. Sometimes, instead of a living dome and a low canopy, they used the ground as natural protection. Under the roots of large trees or in small hollows in the soil, they hollowed out a rounded bowl. It was important that there was at least a slight slope around it so that the water would drain away. Such a pit did not like clayey slurry. They preferred dense soil or a sandy layer that would not wash away instantly. This created the basis for a closed hearth, protected by the relief itself. This earthen bowl became the heart of a small underground structure. Around it, they compacted the soil, lined the edges with stones, and made a rim to prevent water from flowing out. On top, they laid a dense covering of branches and pieces of turf, leaving a narrow passage for air and smoke. The result was a kind of low oven hidden in the thickness of the earth. It was almost impossible for rain to get inside, and the draft arose on its own due to the temperature difference. The fire was in a protected niche where the elements could not reach it. Sometimes these bowls were supplemented with small stone walls that directed the wind. They helped to strengthen or weaken the draft, depending on how they were turned. People observed where strong gusts of wind most often blew from and placed the barrier on that side. This is how they controlled the air without a single metal mechanism. Everything was based on an understanding of the terrain and the habits of the local wind. The use of birch bark as a living umbrella was especially common in northern regions. Birch bark repels water well and hardly rots, retaining its flexibility and shape even in damp conditions. A large sheet of bark was rolled into a cone and held over the nascent fire until it gained strength. When the flame became stable, the cone could be tilted and placed under the firewood, turning the protection into fuel. Thus, the same object managed to perform two roles in a matter of minutes. In addition to birch, other resinous barks were used if birch bark was not available. The main thing was that the material did not get wet instantly and kept its shape in the rain. Such improvised umbrellas were sometimes leaned against sticks or poles so as not to hold them up for long. But in the most difficult conditions, a person stood over the fire himself, holding the bark with his hands. This turned the lighting of a fire into work for the entire upper body. It was also important to insulate the fire from the wet ground below. Otherwise, even a strong flame would quickly die in the slush. First, a layer of wet branches was laid down, which served only as a grate, without claiming the role of fuel. Drier branches and thin logs were placed on top of them to create an elevated platform. Sometimes flat stones were used if they were not cracked by water and cold. Such a platform raised the fire above the level of puddles and running water. Do you think you could sit still in the freezing rain, protecting a tiny ember? Watch the video to the end, and in the next chapter you will learn about natural chemicals that burn even in water. Native Americans had tools in their arsenal that could be called natural napalm. They were well aware of the properties of various resins and plant juices that could burn in conditions of 100% humidity. The most valuable resource was pine resin, which was collected from damaged areas of coniferous tree bark. The hardened pieces of resin did not absorb water and burst into a bright, hot flame that could not be extinguished by rain. The resin acted as a powerful accelerant, instantly raising the temperature in the fire to critical levels. Even wet branches coated with heated resin began to hiss and burn, drying themselves with their own heat. Indians often carried a supply of such resin sticks with them for emergencies. It was their strategic energy reserve. Birch bark was another miracle material revered by all forest tribes. Thanks to its tar content, birch bark burns even when completely wet, just taken out of the water. It bursts into flame with a characteristic hum and produces black, oily smoke, but at the same time gives off an enormous amount of heat. Rolled into a tight roll, birch bark worked like a long-burning candle, capable of igniting even damp twigs. Animal fat was also used as fuel in the most desperate situations. If there was no dry kindling, pieces of fat or bone marrow could sustain combustion, working on the principle of an oil lamp. Dripping hot fat soaked into the wood, causing it to burn much more intensely. This was wasteful from a nutritional point of view, but a justified sacrifice for the sake of warmth. There were also certain types of dry mosses and lichens that, when saturated with resin from coniferous trees, became excellent tinder. Grandfather's beard, a lichen hanging from spruce branches, often contains microparticles of resin and remains dry in the wind. When gathered into a ball, it would ignite from the slightest spark, like gunpowder. The Indians knew how to combine these materials, creating layered pies for kindling. They placed birch bark at the bottom, resin on top, and then thin resinous twigs. This design guaranteed success even if their hands were frozen and their movements were clumsy. Their knowledge of forest chemistry replaced modern kindling fluids. They also used rotten wood soaked in oil if they were in regions where oil came to the surface. But this was rare. More often, they relied on plant resources. Each region dictated its own rules and provided its own unique materials. Knowing which wood burned hot and which only smoked was the ABCs of survival. For example, aspen produced little heat, while oak required a strong initial fire, but then burned for a long time. Resinous pine was ideal for starting a fire but shot out sparks, which was dangerous for clothing. Using these natural accelerants saved energy and time. There was no need to dry kindling for hours if you had a handful of resin. It was an efficient use of the resources provided by nature itself. Want to know a secret that will change your life if you find yourself in the woods without matches? Making fire by friction, for example, with a bow, is considered a classic method, but in the rain, this method becomes a real nightmare. The rope gets wet and stretches, the wood swells from moisture, and the friction force drops, preventing the charcoal from reaching the temperature needed to ignite. Native Americans knew that in such weather, the standard approach was doomed to failure, so they used special tricks. The main task was to keep the friction tools completely dry. Fire kits, fireboards, and spindles were carried in waterproof cases made of leather or animal bladders. They were only taken out at the very last moment, already under cover. Even a single drop of water in the drilling hole could stop the process. If the bowstring got wet, it would start to slip. To avoid this, the Indians used straps made of rawhide, which are less prone to stretching, or rubbed the string with resin for better grip. Sometimes they had to dry the string on their own bodies before use. It was a struggle for every bit of friction. In high humidity, wood absorbs moisture from the air, making it difficult to heat. To compensate for this, warriors used softer woods for the base and harder woods for the spindle, increasing the pressure. They had to work faster and harder to evaporate the moisture with muscle power before it could cool the friction point. This required excellent physical training and endurance. Often, the process of obtaining fire was carried out in pairs. One person held and rotated the spindle, while the second covered the area with their cloak and held the upper stop. This allowed them to create the most protected environment possible and speed up the process. Teamwork was the key to success in extreme conditions. There was a method called the fire plow, which was more common in southern regions, but was sometimes used on the plains as well. It was less dependent on ropes, but required perfectly dry wood, which was rare in rainy weather. Therefore, rotation was preferred. Sound was an indicator of success. An experienced craftsman could hear the wood sing. Wet wood made a dull, creaking sound, while dry wood made a clear, high-pitched sound. If the sound was wrong, the process was stopped and the tools were dried again, so as not to waste energy. Particular attention was paid to collecting the dust produced by friction. In humid air, it stuck together and did not want to smolder. A dry leaf or piece of bark was placed under the board to insulate the charcoal from the ground. Each stage was controlled with maniacal thoroughness. Failure to produce fire by friction in cold rain could lead to rapid hypothermia due to the enormous expenditure of energy and sweat. Therefore, if conditions were very poor, this method was abandoned in favor of striking sparks from a stone. Wisdom lay in the ability to change tactics at the right time. Did you know that sweat dripping from your face due to exertion could extinguish the very fire you are trying to start? In the next chapter, you will learn why stones were more reliable than wood in the worst weather. Stone is indeed much more durable than wood. Wood can get wet, soak up moisture, crack from the cold, but stone holds up. Unlike capricious wood, stone is not afraid of water. Therefore, striking a spark with flint on pyrite or a steel striker was the most effective method when surrounded by dampness, rain, and wet hands. For hunters, scouts, and warriors, it was a guarantee that fire would appear, even when it seemed that the world had become damp to the bone. When flint strikes pyrite or steel, a spark appears quickly, without lengthy preparations. This method worked in fog, drizzle, and cold, when fingers were unresponsive. The damp air did not extinguish the spark because the fire was hidden in the strike itself. To light a fire, only one thing was needed: precision of movement. For life in the wild, this meant more than luck. The striking method was not just a matter of convenience, it was part of an everyday survival strategy. It did not require a flat, dry surface, long rubbing of the palms, or cutting a straight stick. The spark from striking pyrite or steel was like a small hot drop of sun. It was born instantly and lived for a second, but that second was enough to ignite the tinder. The method of striking a spark by striking flint against pyrite or a steel striker was the most reliable way to obtain fire in wet weather. Travelers, shamans, and trackers noted that this method worked when friction failed. The important thing was not to let go of the flint and to strike sharply but smoothly. There was no fuss in this strike, only confidence. The spark from the collision is not just a glowing point. It is a physical phenomenon where metal is cut into tiny shavings and heated to the limit. The secret was that the spark from the strike was a tiny piece of red-hot metal. It was not smoldering air, but a real mini coal flying into the palm of your hand. The temperature of this little ember can reach 1,000 degrees, and that's important. That heat was the main force. It beat moisture and dampness faster than water could react. Tinder easily caught a spark, even if the air was heavy with moisture. The fibers of the tinder flared up from the heat, retained the heat, and began to smolder. This was enough to ignite the spark of life. If a person knew how to store tinder, he knew how to preserve the future. The main thing was to keep the tinder itself dry. The rest was done by hand. Plant fluff, mushrooms, fabric, moss, all of these could be used as tinder. But without protection from moisture, it lost its power. Therefore, tinder was cherished like a small grain of fire. Pyrite, or fool's gold, was known to indigenous peoples long before the arrival of outsiders. It was found in the ground, in streams, in layers of rock, glistening like yellow metal. Pyrite was a stone of fire, not wealth. When struck with flint, pyrite produced hot sparks, albeit not the brightest. The spark was quiet, hidden, but honest. It bit into the tinder and gave birth to decay. For a warrior, that was enough. Pyrite was a teacher of patience and confident movement. When striking flint, the technique had to be sliding, sharp, like a small cut. The striking technique had to be sharp and sliding. If you simply struck straight on, the chips would not separate properly. It was a craft of strength, but with intelligence, not head-on, but tangentially, like a small, precise stroke. It required practice, attention, and strong wrists. Every strike was a test of coordination, especially in the cold. It required a strong, precise hand and the ability to feel the distance between the stone and the flint. The striking technique had to remove chips, not break the stone. A few misses could leave your fingers bloody. But this was the path to mastery. The colder the hands became, the more important skill became. It required practice not to break your fingers on frozen stones. To ensure the spark hit the target, the tinder was placed precisely, with almost no gap, directly on the flint. The tinder was placed directly on the surface of the stone. It was held with the thumb so that neither wind nor rain would interfere with the target. The spark flew a short distance, almost immediately hitting the tinder hairs and retaining heat for smoldering. The tinder caught it like a small cap. The time here was shorter than a breath. The distance between the flint and the tinder was minimal so that the spark would not be lost in the cold or damp air. The distance was minimal. It was a rule of precision craftsmanship. If the stone was held further away, the spark would die on the way. The wind was taken into account when working. The back, shoulder, and body protected the spark from gusts. And if the wind helped, it could awaken the smoldering embers like an ally. But more often than not, it was feared rather than awaited. The Indians knew very well where the flint was denser, harder, cleaner, and more reliable. The Indians looked for specific types of flint that produced the best sparks. This was tribal knowledge passed down by the elders. It was the geography of fire. Deposits of good flint and pyrite served as points of trade and peace, where people came unarmed or with weapons as gifts. There they spoke quietly and respectfully, because the stone belonged to everyone. It did not belong to one person. It belonged to the future fire. The flint deposits were known to all the surrounding tribes. The deposits were like a stone library. Here they met, exchanged things, and told each other who had found the best place. And often these lands were untouched by war, because to touch the fire was to touch everyone. Contact with Europeans brought steel flints, which quickly became popular because they produced more sparks and made the work easier. Steel flints quickly replaced pyrite, but the old principle remained the same. Stone and metal fought, but together they created fire. The steel spark was brighter, longer, and more generous in its glow. Sparks fell like a small rain of light. But the technique of the hand, the grip on the tinder, and the protection from the wind remained the same. Steel only reinforced the ancient method. It did not replace the way of thinking. Even if a warrior fell into the water, the method did not fail. He would take out the stone, wring out his clothes, shake off the tinder, and strike the flint again. Even if a warrior fell into a river, he could wipe the stone and immediately strike fire. This was an advantage when the struggle with nature was a daily, honest routine. This method was especially good for scouts because it did not require much energy and helped them remain hidden. The friction of the stick was louder, longer, and required the use of breath and shoulders. This method was quieter than walking. It was a method of lightning enclosed in the palms, and therefore it sprouted not in noise, but in result. One strike and a small smoldering began. The scout could hide it under his cloak like a secret, fan it later, and not give himself away. The spark of the stone had a sacred meaning. Sparks from the stone were considered lightning caught in the rock. It was a gift from the storm and the power of heaven. Man felt that he was not stealing the flame, but releasing what was already in the world. Hunger and cold made carving more important because it saved energy. The stone method required fewer calories. There was no need to rotate the stick until you broke a sweat. One spark was enough to create future heat. It was a choice made by practical people, not by luck. It was the choice of survival craftsmen who knew the value of energy. It was the choice of pragmatists and masters who did their work accurately and quickly. Stone did not save them on its own. It was the skill to use it that saved them. Fire was a technology of action, not a decoration of beauty. Simply throwing branches into a pile is a sure way to be left without heat. In the rain, the structure of the fire is crucial. The Indians used a design that is now called an upside-down fire. The thickest logs were placed at the bottom, with smaller logs on top and so on, up to the very top where small kindling was placed. This architecture allowed the fire to burn from top to bottom. The heat from the upper flames dried the lower layers of logs before the fire reached them. Moisture evaporated downward without extinguishing the flames, which always remained at the top. It was a self-sustaining system, ideal for wet weather. Another type was the hut fire, but with tightly packed outer logs that acted as a roof for the inner core of heat. Water ran down the outer branches while the flames raged inside. The main thing was to ensure a sufficient angle of inclination so that water did not flow into the center. The Indians also built reflectors out of logs or stones behind the fire. These walls not only directed the heat towards the people, but also protected the fire from wind and rain. A correctly placed reflector created a zone of turbulence that deflected raindrops away from the hearth. An important rule was not to place wood directly on wet ground. A platform was always made of dry logs or stones. This created a draft from below and insulated the coals from the swampy mud. The fire had to breathe and not suffocate in the steam from the ground. Arranging the wood in a star shape saved fuel and made it easy to regulate the intensity of the fire by simply moving the logs toward the center. This was convenient in the rain, as the ends of the logs remained cold and could be held with your hands. The center of the star was the hottest place, where any moisture burned away. For nighttime heating, long logs were used, laid along the body of the sleeper, a nodya fire. In the rain, an additional piece of leather or bark could be stretched over such a fire. The logs protected each other from getting wet, burning only where they touched. Choosing a place under the crown of a large tree was risky because of the dripping that continued even after the rain had stopped. The Indians preferred open places where they could quickly build an artificial shelter. They did not rely on random shelters. The ability to stack wood so that it protected itself was an art. Each log had its place and function. It was survival engineering, where mistakes cost warmth. When a fire was just starting, it was weak and vulnerable. The Indians used a technique that may seem strange. They covered the smoldering fire with their blankets or skins, leaving only a small opening for draft. This created a chamber of hot air that prevented rain from getting inside. The essence of the method was to create a microclimate. Heat accumulated under the skin, which instantly dried the kindling. Smoke seeped through the pores of the skin or fabric, making it waterproof. A person sat nearby, holding the edges of the blanket, literally feeding the fire in its cradle. Using one's own body as part of the fire structure was the norm. The heat of the human body helped start the process, and then the fire returned the favor by warming the person. This symbiotic relationship was literal, not metaphorical. In the most difficult moments, the line between the warmth of blood and the warmth of fire was blurred. Thick bison hides were ideal for this. The fur did not ignite instantly from an accidental spark and held the heat dome well. European fabrics often flared up or burned through, making this method dangerous for inexperienced settlers. This technique also allowed the fire to be hidden from enemies. The light of the flames was not visible under the thick hide, and the smoke dissipated at ground level. On military campaigns, this was the only way to heat food or dry moccasins without the risk of being detected. The steam rising from damp wood could extinguish the flames. The blanket forced the steam to escape to the sides without condensing back into the fire. It was a matter of controlling air currents based on intuition and the physics of gases. When the fire gained strength, the skin was removed but continued to be used as a windbreak. Drying the skin itself by the fire was a ritual before bedtime. Dry clothes were the second half of the survival equation. The Indians were not afraid of the smell of smoke. It was the smell of life. Smoked clothes repelled water and insects better. Smoke was their ally, not just a byproduct of combustion. Once the fire was burning steadily, it became a tool of salvation. The first thing they did was build a fence of wet wood around it. It dried from the heat, preparing to become the next fuel, and at the same time acted as a screen to retain heat. This drying cycle was a continuous process. One burns, the other dries. Fire was used to signal lost members of the tribe. In the rain, smoke spreads low, but the bright light of the fire, reflected from wet leaves and raindrops, is visible from afar. It was a beacon of hope in the gray mist of the storm. The heat from the fire was used to warm stones. Hot stones could be brought into the teepee or under the shelter to warm the sleeping area without an open fire. This was a safe way to heat, especially if the shelter was cramped. The fire was also used to work on tools. In wet weather, wood became flexible, and over the heat of the coals, arrow shafts could be straightened or sled runners could be bent. Craftsmanship did not stop even in bad weather. The psychological effect of a stable, humming flame was enormous. It gave people a sense of control over the situation. Conversations began around the fire, stories were told, and fear receded. Fire transformed the chaos of the wild into an orderly human world. The ashes from the fire were used as lye for washing and treating skins. Even the waste from combustion was put to good use. Nothing in nature was wasted, and the cycle of resource use was closed. Keeping the fire going in the rain required constant vigilance. It was impossible to simply fall asleep and hope for morning. Those on duty took turns, adding wood and watching over the canopy. This strengthened social bonds and trust within the group. The ability to light and maintain a fire in the pouring rain was the highest manifestation of the art of living in harmony with nature. It proved that man was not a victim of the elements, but their worthy partner. The history of survival of the indigenous peoples of North America teaches us that there is no such thing as bad weather, only a lack of knowledge and preparation. Their methods of obtaining fire in heavy rain are a combination of a deep understanding of the physics, chemistry, and biology of the forest, multiplied by incredible strength of spirit. They did not fight the rain, they outplayed it, finding dry loopholes in the wet wall of reality. Today, with high-tech burners and waterproof matches, we often forget that true confidence comes not from gadgets, but from skills and calmness. The ability to find a dry core in a wet log or preserve a coal in a bison horn is a metaphor for how to seek hope and resources in the most difficult situations in life. Which of the methods described did you find most surprising? Carrying fire in mushrooms or building a micro tent for a spark? Write in the comments what other skills of ancient people you would like to learn about. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new journeys into the past.